Dark forests, a wild borderland lost for generations, and ruins of the before, enticing the foolish and desperate back to the wild frontier. That's right, folks, we're building a world again. Hello friends, Anderson here. Let's do some more worlding without number. World building without number rather, or world building using worlds without number, which is what we're getting up to in this series. Although we're not going to limit ourselves exclusively to worlds without number, but it is what we are mostly going to be relying on. This is the session 0 of a very extensive project series that I am about to embark on together with you. And for the purpose of this, I will also host some of the things that we will be building here on a new website called kiltanratsrpg.com, because I think eventually the amount of things linked in the description is going to get out of hand a little bit. So there is now a site in place to have a look at anything we will be generating here. And before I get to what we will be generating here and why this is a session 0 for a world building series, let me just quickly invite you, particularly for this series, to leave a comment. I know it's the usual YouTuber thing, leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, hit the bell. All of that would be much appreciated, but in this case, the commenting is a very integral part of the process of how we do the world building, because if we've learned anything from the first time round that we did Worlds Without Number on this channel, it is that it just gets better if it becomes a two-way street and we can do these additions from the comment section again. So I will be looking forward to your input for this series as well, because that is part of, if not the main part of, the fun. So what are we actually building here? Well, this time around we are building an entire campaign setting, including an expanded world around it, and we'll go into a lot more detail. It'll be a dark fantasy setting. It will be generated to support both solo and group play. It'll be system agnostic, and it'll be very extensive. And since this is a solo RPG channel, which heavily relies on random generation through sets of tables, it will heavily rely on random generation through sets of tables. And that means one thing first and foremost: Worlds Without Number. That is what we have been following the guidelines of in the prior series. It worked out well. We have been using a lot of the one roll tables, a lot of the fleshing out tables. We'll be using that as our main framework. And besides that, we will be using a lot of other books. We will be using The Perilous Wilds. I have, in the meantime, managed to acquire the English version, so no more Gefährliche Weiten. We will be using the books of random tables, of which there are many, and there are also sci-fi and cyberpunk and modern versions, and they're all pretty good, if a little bit insular in their use cases, but they will supply us with some input, as well as the Ultimate Toolbox, which is sort of a massive collection of all sorts of random bits and bobs. Xanathar's Guide to help us with naming again. And the current version of the Tome of Adventure Design, there is a new one that has just been kickstarted and I'm eagerly awaiting it. But we'll still be starting the use of the current one, the current generation of the Tome of Adventure Design, to supply some more detailed, let's say, plots in case we need to work out what specific thing happened between those two factions, and we need to go into a bit more fine detail, because there are villainous plots in here and various just story bits that we can use to go a little bit further into detail than Worlds Without Number regularly supplies us with. And that's not all. I will be using whatever other books I come across. There are some in the mail, there are some that no doubt will make it to the shelves in the time this series will be running, because I anticipate that this series will be running for quite a while. And that is down to the scope of this quote-unquote project. I'm calling it Project Bleakwood, which is sort of my working title because the thing needs a name. it is going to be quite an extensive effort, and it will be bleak and centered around woods. Bleak in a sense of theme, fun in a sense of building it. So what exactly is the scope of this? The scope here is going a lot farther than the previous series. We are looking to create an entire campaign setting, so enough material fleshed out in some level of detail with enough plot hooks, enough NPCs, enough regional development to comfortably run a campaign or several campaigns in, and that, if everything were to be compiled together, would make the backbone of a reasonably sized campaign source book, which is part of the point, because I would like to make at the end of this and throughout this, adding up on it bit by bit, a reasonably sized campaign source book. So in the end, what we should have, however many episodes of this series down the line, is something downloadable. So we will be ending up with a digital product, potentially. I say product because it is going to be a thing that is made in that sense, not in the sense of I will try to sell this to you. This is going to be a collaborative effort for the fun of it. So whatever digital copy emerges from this will be forever free. So why a session 0 for a world building series? Well, for me, that really is down to I don't want to publish an episode called Worlds Without Number Episode 1 and then barely be touching Worlds Without Number in that episode. So it's a session 0, which enables us to generate all the setup that is needed to be able to use Worlds Without Number. So it's going to not include a lot of tool use, but it will nonetheless include a lot of world building, because we will need to hash out some of the cornerstones of what we're actually building towards and what dark fantasy setting actually means to me, because I feel like that is quite a broad strokes term. And well, if you've seen some of my other series, you might be able to take a guess, but I would like to approach this somewhat structurally. And in this series, I'd also like to go a bit farther and actually document pretty much the entirety of the process of building a setting and give sort of a complete picture of how I go about building a world. I'm by no means an expert or a published setting author or anything like that. I'm a fairly seasoned GM and now fairly seasoned or reasonably seasoned solo player. And I have some things that have always worked for me, which I feel like I'll be sharing out. And if they work for you, that's great. But there are so many other ways of doing this. And I also have to add the caveat that outside of the first series of building the city of Coleraine, I've never really used random tables to generate a setting. So this will be new for me as well. And that's also the part that I look forward to the most, because the way that the oracles, the tables, the random inputs have of challenging me to not pick the first thing that comes to mind, but rather having to connect some dots and like integrating some curveballs, in the end, to my mind, makes for a better outcome, for a better product. It's almost like having a relatively challenging, if somewhat erratic co-author. And then to add to that, getting the input from the comments section will make it a lot greater than anything I would be capable of doing just sitting down and putting pen to paper for myself. So that's the part where I'm really curious what the outcome of this exercise is going to be. So let's talk a little bit about the setting in its roughest form and why specifically I picked a dark fantasy setting, because that's not exactly something that's never been done before. I'll touch on the whole never been done before a bit later, but in essence, dark fantasy is the thing that comes most natural to me. It's the one genre or type of genre, subgenre that I consume the most of, that I enjoy playing the most, and that is what I default to pretty much as my main go-to if I want to have some fun and be creative. But like I said, dark fantasy in itself, grim dark fantasy, is a bit of a generic term. So the first thing I did when thinking about how to approach this was something that I've done before when I was fleshing out settings, and that is to give myself 5 minutes to sit down and write down the first keywords that come to mind when thinking about the topic. I do this for all kinds of things. I do this at work, I do this for other creative endeavors, and I did this here. And the list that I came up with is as follows. When I think of dark fantasy, I think of deep dark forests. That is, well, perhaps even visible behind me because I have an entire collection of Symbaroum books here. And this Davokar forest, or even Mirkwood, or some other expressions of this cliche almost, are very evocative to me. I love this whole image of this primal, long forgotten forest where there are things in there that have not been seen in generations and stuff like that. So dark forests for me is a very evocative part of this, as is then something sinister that is hidden in the far off center of these woods, as well as ruins of the before. I always like if there's some kind of inscrutable ruin and long lost civilization that we can find things of, or where there is undead that are not finding rest and they're stalking around these ruins and things like that. I also like my corrupt empires filled with conspiracy that is perhaps also instilled by my love for all things Warhammer, and even Zweihander and Warlock, which are sort of retro clones of Warhammer, original old Hammer. I like myself some wild borderlands, some frontiers, some rugged frontiers. I also like that in a lot of ways dark, and especially grim dark fantasy, takes on classic ideas and adds like a twist and a spin to them, although that has now almost become a cliche in and of itself, but I do rather like that. So to think of like not just the stereotypical elf, but in this setting they're all cannibals, or something like that. You have, generally speaking, something to put a spin on a classic thing that you have encountered, which makes it both recognizable but somewhat fresh. To my mind, it's also always something that is relatively human-centric, which to some people might make it boring, and I understand that. And to service those desires, I think there's also kind of a trend right now to revert that and to make things a lot more diverse and just colorful. And my association with dark fantasy is generally something more earth-toned and monochromatic, and the whole human-centricness plays into that a little bit. It's not to say we're not going to have other origins, other peoples, other races, if you will, out there. It just means that the viewpoint that we're going to adopt from our empire side and for our perspective of the region we're going to flesh out, we're going to assume a human perspective on that. So a bit like that, we pick a region to flesh out, and there are probably prior inhabitants there that aren't human who'd be very surprised and somewhat offended to be told that this is new land. But for the humans it is. And so for us, that's the design perspective we assume. We're not going to have like an omniscient campaign designer. Well, in a way we do, but we're going to put a spin on it and always portray the things from the human-centric perspective. Another dark fantasy cliche that often gets trotted out is that elves are no longer nice. They're mostly bastards nowadays. That's almost become the new cliche. But it's just something I rather like. Comes back down to my fairly intense love of the Birthright AD&D 2nd edition setting, where elves were a little bit rude and very xenophobic, and also just whatever came down the last couple of decades and just handed us worse and worse versions of elves, at least from, again, a human perspective. From their own perspective, it's probably entirely reasonable. I do also like my wild plains filled with orc clans. Again, there's a box behind me from my days of youth called Das Orkland, from the Das Schwarze Auge setting, the Dark Eye setting, which basically fleshes out a whole wild region filled with orc clans and their cultures. I always liked that very much, so I'd like to have an element of that in my setting as well. Naturally, dark gods come to mind when thinking of dark fantasy, when thinking of Warhammer, when thinking of other settings in that vein. One very integral aspect of fun for me is also the aspect of rediscovering something that was lost, like a lost civilization of the past, almost like a post-apocalyptic approach of rediscovering the world after some calamity, or part of the world after some calamity. So I'd like to enter that into the mix as well. I do also rather like my hub cities. I always like it if, even if it's a wild frontier or a remote region of the world, there should be some kind of legendary city that has some kind of reputation, even if it's a bad one. The dark gods tend to go hand in hand with the threat of demons and chaos, so I also like an aspect of that where at maybe some part of the world is lost to demons or chaos, or unreality bleeds into reality, it's all unstable and whatnot. Like, that's definitely something I like exploring. I do like myself a cool ranger, a wilderness ranger, roaming through that dark forest and generally being on top of things and very good at not being seen, because there are so many things out there that will eat your face. And also just generally orders of dark rangers or good rangers, or, you know, all that kind of general flavor of cloak-wearing, bow-slinging badasses. I like that. That's also why I wrote down the Night's Watch from A Song of Ice and Fire, because that is kind of a ranger outfit, and it also ties into this kind of idea of a borderlands, and it was just an association I had. Same with the next 2 points, the idea of something ancient lurking out there and something old, some old folk that were driven deep into the woods. That is a little bit of an analogy to the Others and the Children of the Forest, but that is generally also kind of a cliche that I enjoy for world building, where you can stumble into some ancient, wizened figure that basically tells you, yeah, thanks for catching on that these shambling corpses that are currently overrunning your villages are just the 15th iteration of this happening in the world. The cycle completes again. And also, I like myself some mega dungeons and cursed cities, and I like having those out there as sort of a dark fantasy dungeon delve material, so we'll also be building a few of those. And lastly, I like monotheistic faiths, inquisitions, and holy orders. Like is perhaps too strong a word. I enjoy having them in my settings. I don't necessarily enjoy them as much having them in the real world, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, specifically the Inquisitions. I think we're hopefully past that. So those were my cornerstones that I kept in mind when thinking about where would I like to go with this, what elements would I like to integrate into this setting. And you might be thinking now, so far so standard, we've heard that all before, where's a new thing in that? How is this innovative? And the answer is, of course, yes, there is no new stuff in general. Sorry. At least if you go to that higher conceptual level. All of this, as Battlestar Galactica has been trying to teach you, has happened before and will happen again, because if we go higher and higher on the meta, every idea has already been done to death a million times. So when it comes to originality, it's really about the composition and the weight we give to certain elements and pieces of our setting, and basically the weight we design to individual parts and the sum of the parts in our composition, and also how we deal with and integrate all the wildcards that are thrown at us by these oracles and these random generation die results, which will probably yield something that in that form that will be the outcome of it has not been done in quite exact the same way before. And I feel like that's good enough for me. And maybe lastly on that point, you can probably cut whatever we will be building here open and anything else that's been built open and dissect it and go, haha, that's that trope, that's this trope. And if you're inclined to that way of thinking, and if that way of thinking has ever kept you from writing anything or embarking on any kind of creative endeavor, I just say, forget about it. Go for it anyway. The fact that meta elements exist to any kind of writing is not a blocking point for you to not start writing. So let's just get on with it, huh? So if we reflect back on all of these points and elements that I enjoy about dark fantasy, and trying to focus and zoom in on one element that gives us sort of a guiding light of what can we do to condense the most of these elements into one specific piece of a setting, to me that feels like the most natural thing to start building with is a frontier region, a wild borderlands region. So that was my takeaway from this brainstorming session, and that's also about as far as I thought so far, in that I would like to build a borderlands region, a frontier area that has recently become accessible again. So that'll be the point where we rediscover a part of the world that was locked off. We'll have to decide how it got locked off, but it'll also give us the potential to integrate dark forest, ruins, the ones from before, demons, chaos, orc tribes, whatever you want to place in there. It'll probably have room in there, or at least adjacent to there. So I would say we'll make a focal point of this is our to be fleshed out region, but we also infer and decide that there are things around it, since we also decided there needs to be some empire of some sort. And that means to start with, we just put our border region front and center and just place other parts around it, and then maybe at some point down the line start exploring and drilling down into them and playing in them too. That's another part of the story, by the way. Do I intend to play in a campaign in this setting? Of course, but it'll take quite a while to design it, so I can't really tell you what I'll be playing in there or when. Especially since, first of all, I still want to play Scarlet Heroes in our recently designed City of Coleraine, but I anticipate this to take months, if not a year plus to complete, if we keep at it regularly. So we will be playing it, but not immediately. So let's see what set pieces we can already identify if we just put our borderlands in the center. So I will be just drawing a little rectangular box here, which is our borderlands region that we will be exploring. And let's see what we can actually place in there already that we know needs to exist and what we can put in relation with each other. And I think the first thing we need to understand is, how did this region get cut off? What blocking point is there that keeps you from reaching it, around it, or near it? And what was actually the cut off calamity? So Forbidden Lands, for instance, has some kind of mechanism in there where a sorcerer king unleashed a kind of a miasma that made it impossible to traverse the lands. I'm probably oversimplifying this here, but that's generally the drift of what I had in mind. So something that made it impossible to get in there, and hopefully not like overtly magical in nature. I do like magic in my settings, but I don't particularly like it to be super flashy. So whatever happened probably had some kind of supernatural background, but it is very mysterious to the common person, and perhaps no one, save for the mightiest of scholars, understand it, and they're not sharing. So what quote-unquote natural cause could there be, or pseudo-magical cause could there be? Deadly mist, rain of fire, an ice age, a flood, a constant eruption of earthquakes. I am instinctively fairly drawn to the idea of frost, to have it be some kind of a extreme temperature shift that made it impossible to travel because of heaps of snow, and perhaps just simply the fact that there is something between our human-centric perspective of that corrupt empire that we're maybe looking at this from as our border region, and there is something in between there, probably some set of mountains or something, that makes it impossible for the regular person or anybody really within the last couple of generations to cross over those mountains. At least no humans done it that we currently know of. And there definitely wasn't regular traffic, and there definitely were no news that came through to the Empire. Which means we can imply that there is a big old set of mountains somewhere to the of the borderlands that is between where the Empire is and where the borderlands are. So we can also infer that wherever we put the mountains, to the extension of that direction, the Empire will be. So let's put them to the south, because I kind of instinctively like the idea of separating the map like that and having sort of the southern empire of corruption and decadence that is maybe somewhat derided in our more rugged area and in our hub city here, which we can also then probably already place relatively soon. But let's add some mountain ranges here. I am far from a map making artist, so this is just a rough draft, and either I'll feed it to a program, or if we're a bit farther down the line, I'll have one made. But that also means we have our empire blob somewhere here, so there it goes. It's kind of the first elements of the wider world that we can just extrapolate from what we want to have in here, and without really needing to roll for it much, we're still establishing pretty much the framework of in which we want to start building. And then we also have our first thing that we need to flesh out, which is the empire, which no doubt has some kind of stake or representation in the efforts directed at our borderlands. I think we can pretty much place the hub city now, because it also needs to be relatively close to where you traverse the mountain. It sort of makes sense, as that's one of the first things you run into when you make it through. So put it here somewhere. And so there's like a pass connection winding down towards the Empire somewhere. We'll flesh it out, give it a name and all of that once we actually reach the worlds without number stage of this series. So this is not something we're going to do today. We also got a lot of space and empty canvas here for all other potential locations that we have dreamed up. But since we already created a mountain range, I also have a fairly immediate reaction to what kind of mega dungeon could we place here. And that sort of gives me the vibe of, well, we have a bunch of mountains and they were snowed in for generations. There was no communication. So perhaps there is a now dead former blossoming dwarven city there. So thinking of Carrack, Eight Peaks or Moria, that kind of set element. And maybe what happens is after the frost clears and the humans sent their parties out, they realize that their old reluctant trading buddies, the dwarves, haven't reopened their gates yet, and no attempts to establish communication with them has succeeded. And while there are dwarves in the world, the sort of peak of their civilization, the pride of their people remains sealed off, and there are only dark rumors of what is happening there. So let's just put a dollop in here and call it the Dead Dwarf City, whereas this one is the hub. And then we'll see what else we can cook up. I think I'll make another blob here and just call it the Orc Lands. And there's just a little bit of overlap to our Borderlands region that's wedged in between there that we are going to be exploring. And it's going to be bordering the Orc Lands that I just have kind of a soft spot for. And we might encounter orcs that are raiding parties because it's a rite of passage or because they are outcasts from their very honor-focused tribes that won't have their behaviors, and so they intrude on human lands and become raiders and give orcs a bad name. But I don't want to have like the stereotypical all orcs bad kind of iteration going on here. I just want to have some reason why there could potentially be orc raids, because who doesn't like a good orc raid in their fantasy game? As far as additional points that we can infer go, I think there must have also been some kind of ancient civilization here at some point, of which maybe then this Southern Empire was in a reverse kind of historical mirror thing, the remotest borderland outpost, and we have now got the ruins of that old Northern Empire that went down out there, overlapping with our Borderlands region. But it was many years ago and we don't know much about it. Maybe it was even an elven empire because we like our elves to be fallen bastards in this setting, and maybe they used to have some kind of heyday civilization and now they're all sad and morose and hostile or something. But oh, maybe they don't even like humans intruding on their old ruins. We can flesh it out later. The gist of the message basically is we need some reason why there are ruins out there, and the more the merrier. I also would like some more dynamic in this region, even during the time it was cut off. So thinking back to A Song of Ice and Fire again, maybe we also have our equivalent of the clans, the wildlings, some non-humans, like some factions we need to place here that were active here during the time that it was cut off, because it'll just make it more interesting if the various pieces here and setting elements have changed hands constantly during a variety of armed conflicts with the factions that remain here and are native to this area, and that we in turn might also end up getting into conflict with on our Southern Empire's behalf. I think these are all pieces that we can just assume exist and need to flesh out somewhere later down the line, but we don't need to place any of that now. We just need to have this sort of rough outline here that leaves us a lot of empty space to throw things at as we progress further down the design process. Lastly, one thing that I'd like to do is to submit for consideration sort of a name, a working name for our border region, so we don't keep calling it the Borderlands, or at least it's not the official name in the setting then. And in the past I've often rolled up names just using random tables, and we could also do that now. I would like to have an original name, but we could do that in sort of a portmanteau fashion that I've done in the past, just rolling up a couple of names, taking syllables from each and bashing that together into something new. But since this is sort of a from the ground up series where I also share a few things maybe with you that perhaps you haven't stumbled across before, I would like to introduce you to the English language, which is not exactly the English language. It's a resource I've been using for quite a while now, where it is a project that envisions what English would sound like if the other side had won the battle in 1066 and English had more of a Germanic influence than a Romance or Francophone influence. So there's a bunch of words there in a web resource that I'll link you to that are very English sounding without actually being English used words. And it is quite helpful to generate a bunch of syllables to throw a name together with. So I'm gonna have a quick session now just going through that website, picking a few words associated with the border, the boundary, the frontier, the outlands, the wildlands, something like that, and seeing what I can come up with that sounds cool. Okay, so we have some potential names here that we could think about using. We have the waymark or the waymarch or the wayland, the farland, the offward, the mereland, the meremark, the meremarch, the withermark. That's a personal favorite. I kind of blackened that one, but just because it stood out to me, and I kind of a note to self. The withermark, the withermarch, again one I rather like. The wentmark, the wentmarch, I also like that one. That one's probably my personal favorite. The eddermark or eddermarch, from an old English word called eodor, which is an enclosure or protector, or the ellandmark, the elland march, elland mark. I think those are all kind of good options if we want to fall into that linguistic touch point, and I think that will make it quite easily scalable to just expand on adding words in that theme to our setting. So I would like to keep using this English as a resource for this particular flavoring of nomenclature, and also use, of course, some of the random tables that have a similar linguistic touch, or even a different linguistic touch if we need to add some elements that aren't necessarily from that piece of, or from that same piece of cultural background. Of course, if you have naming suggestions yourself, just drop them in the comments. If you have a name here that you like, leave a comment as well. I will pick a few from here and from the comments, make a little D6 or D10 table, and just roll up what the name is gonna be at the start of the next session, because we need to, of course, roll for it, even though we can pick the proposals, but the ultimate decision should be up to the dice. So that's it really, that's the setup, that's how we develop a rough idea of what we want to fill the blanks in of, and there are of course a lot of blanks, and that's how we start using worlds without number, but we will of course be doing that next time. So thank you very much for watching, I'll catch you next time, and bye for now.